Yeah, good morning, everyone. Today is January 7th, 2021, and I am at the famous Boot Hill Cemetery, Boot Hill Graveyard. So let's go inside and have a look around. Okay, folks, once you buy your ticket, step into the cemetery here. There's the gift shop here on your left and the restrooms. And this is the cemetery. All right, everyone who visits gets a brochure. Hang on to that brochure because it's a great guide and resource. It provides lots of interesting information and will help you navigate the graveyard and make your stay here more enjoyable. Okay, folks, the entry fee is $3, and you can stay all day here if you like. The cemetery was first laid out in 1878, just 1 year after prospector Ed Schefflin founded Tombstone in 1877. All right, all the tours are self-guided. Now, there are hundreds of fascinating people buried here, and there are two ways to actually see the grave sites. You can just pick a random site, or you can see the grave sites by row, your choice. Either way, there are some amazing characters buried here. Well, approximately 250 grave sites have been identified and historically recorded here in the cemetery, but there are many who are interred here that are anonymous. There are only 3 granite grave markers in the entire cemetery. All the other grave markers are made of wood. And most of the deaths took place in the 1880s in the cemetery. And judging by the dates on the grave sites, the most violent times took place between 1880 and 1882. There are some fictitious grave sites here as well, and we'll see those during the tour. And here we see the 3 most famous people buried here. And that's Billy Clanton, brothers Frank and Tom McClary, and they all died in a now famous gunfight on the 26th of October, 1881, better known as the shootout at the OK Corral. The actual gunfight lasted only 30 seconds and took place in a narrow vacant lot 6 doors down from the OK Corral. Traditionally, in old Western cemeteries, the grave sites are covered with rocks and stones. This is not only aesthetic, it was practical. Normally, graves were rather shallow, and the pile of rocks kept bodies from exposure to the elements and from the predators. As in all the Western towns, there are legends and there are facts. Sometimes it's hard to know the real from the fraudulent. So let's have a look at some of the fictitious grave sites. All right, fictitious site number 1 belongs to Lester Moore, and his epitaph reads, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, no less, no more." Now the truth is there was never a man named Lester Moore who was killed in the Arizona Territory. It was all made up to add a whimsical twist. And next up we have George Johnson. And according to the epitaph, Johnson was hanged by mistake. He was right, we was wrong. We strung him up, and now he's gone. Well, again, there are no historic records of a man named George Johnson who was hanged in Arizona. Totally made up, totally fictitious. And next runner-up is John Heath. And John Heath was a real person who organized a robbery that led to the Bisbee Massacre of 1883. He He was eventually caught and convicted for his crimes and was later abducted from the Tombstone jail and lynched by an angry mob on the 22nd of February, 1884. However, Heath is not buried here. In fact, his corpse was returned to his estranged wife and is buried in Terrell, Texas. And our next fictitious site is that of Tom Harper. Now, like John Heath, he was a real person and was apparently hanged for killing a man named Tolliday. But like Heath, Tom Harper is not buried here. In fact, he was buried in Tucson and not in Boot Hill Cemetery. And next up on the list of fictitious grave sites is that of Federico Deron, better known as Federico Duran. Like Heath and Harper, he was a well-known outlaw. However, he was not shot by John Slaughter. That's a total falsehood. Truth be told, he and his fellow outlaw Jack Taylor were executed by firing squad in Guaymas, Mexico in December of 1889. Boot Hill Cemetery is the final resting place of lots of villains and outlaws, but there are some lawmen who are buried here as well. Let's have a look at a few of them. And we are now visiting the gravesite of Judge Charles Lindley. According to historic records, Lindley was one of the ablest members of the bar in California. Due to overwork, however, his health declined quickly, and he eventually died in Tombstone in September of 1882. And we now see the resting place of John Gillespie. He was dispatched to arrest outlaws Billy Grounds and Swing Hunt, who were suspects in the killing of M.R. Peel, whose grave, by the way, is on the immediate right. He was fatally wounded by Hunt, who shot him in the head. And it is often customary to leave money offerings on the grave sites of lawmen, and there are plenty of coins and dollar bills left on John Gillespie's grave. And we see the gravesite of Marshal Fred White, who was killed by Curly Bill as he attempted to disarm him. The incident took place on the land currently occupied by the Birdcage Theater in Tombstone. And as we see, there are plenty of money offerings left on Fred Marshall's gravesite. Mrs. Stewart died in 1880, and according to family members, she was the first female buried in Boot Hill Cemetery. Her gravesite was never located and is among the unknown. Another noteworthy woman is Delia William. And Delia was a black woman and owner of a lodging house on Toughnut Street in Tombstone. She committed suicide by taking arsenic in 1881. And we now see the gravesite of Margarita, a dance hall girl in Tombstone, possibly a prostitute. She was killed by another woman, nicknamed Gold Dollar, in a jealous rage over a man. Now, there are only 3 granite gravestones here in Boot Hill Cemetery, and this one belongs to Mr. M.R. Peel, a young mining engineer, and while working in his office late one night, he was murdered, possibly by criminals Grounds and Hunt. He died immediately from a gunshot wound to the head. And strangely enough, just adjacent to Mr. Peel's grave, we find the gravesite of John Gillespie, the same man who attempted to arrest the two criminals who shot Peel in 1882. Okay, folks, as I mentioned, there are only three grave markers that are made of granite, and this is the second of the three. This one belongs to Emmett Crook Nunnally. He was born in 1884 and died in 1946. But Nunnally helped the townspeople and spent the last years of his life actually helping to restore Boothill Cemetery, at least as much as could be restored. And he was instrumental in helping create this cemetery as an historic monument. But his last request was to be interred here. And we see the third and final granite gravestone here in Boothill Cemetery. And this one belongs to John Swain Slaughter. He died just short of his 100th birthday in 1945. And he arrived in Tombstone with his family in 1879 when Tombstone was still in its infancy. And he spent most of his life in and around Tombstone. All right, this is one of the more unique grave sites here in Boothill Cemetery. And it's surrounded by an original wrought iron cage. It belongs to Mrs. Stump. Let's have a look. Okay, folks, this is the grave marker, one of the more unique grave markers here in Boothill Cemetery. Mrs. Stump died in 1884 during childbirth, apparently from an overdose of chloroform given to her by the family doctor. And this information was confirmed by a family member. All right, folks, we can see another rather unique grave site here. This one belongs to Frank Bowles. Let's have a closer look. All right, this is the resting place of Frank Bowles. And apparently he was thrown from a horse in 1880, and that caused his rifle to discharge and went through his knee. Well, he was laid up for several weeks without any medical attention. And by the time his friends got to him, or got him to a doctor, it was too late. And he died on August 26th of 1880. Here's a rather simple grave marker. It just says "to Chinese." And apparently they both died of leprosy. Here's another unique grave site in the cemetery, and this one belongs to Quan Ki, who owned a Chinese restaurant in Tombstone called Can Can. He was originally buried in a pauper's grave, but eventually his buddies had his corpse moved here next to his fellow Chinese friends. And just adjacent, we find the gravesite of Mrs. Ah Lum, better known as China Mary, and was interred here in 1906. She apparently had a great influence over the Chinese community in Tombstone, and she may have had some Tong affiliations back in China. Well, there are obviously lots of fascinating people interred in Boot Hill Cemetery. Way too many to cover in just one video. But whether it's the good, the bad, the ugly, or even the unknown, I'm sure they'd all have amazing stories to tell you. So if you're ever in Tombstone, make sure you drop by.
All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed the little tour of famous or maybe infamous Boot Hill graveyard and cemetery. Hope you're having a great day and a great evening, a wonderful start to 2021, and we'll catch up in the next video.